Brown.
I said Braun. Yeah.
Braun.
Yeah.
Right, good evening everybody. It's exactly 5 o'clock, so we're going to kick off. It looks like everybody's here. Manfred Braun, thanks very much for giving our 4th lecture in the series on green energy, 4th and last. We've had some pretty interesting ones, quite a nice variety. Manfred, as you can see there, he's going to be talking about buildings. And I won't tell you anything more about them, because I'm sure he'll tell you all about them. His background, he's currently the Chief Technical Officer at the Green Building Council of South Africa. And he heads up all the technical education and certification-related matters since 2010. He's a registered professional electrical engineer. He's got a background as an engineer and a sustainability consultant with the WSP group. During his time at WSP, they achieved the first 4 Green Star rating in South Africa. Maybe you can tell us what that was for. The WSP Green by Design achieved the first star rating. You'll have to explain that to us. He also sits on the University of Pretoria's Construction Property Studies Advisory Board, and he's a judge on the Eskom ITA Awards. And if you wonder what ITA is, anybody know? It's a Greek letter. Anybody know what it stands for? Okay, I didn't. I Googled it. Efficiency. So the ITA Awards are the Efficiency Awards.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. It's great to have you here. Maybe just wanted to get a sense of the audience, whether any of you have actually ever worked in the built environment sort of property sector or any of that space. Just to maybe show of hands, get a sense. Okay, so some of you are maybe familiar with the property sector. That's interesting. I'm expecting the rest of you to really be from a whole bunch of different, sort of coming from different aspects. So this talk is not geared at property people. It's really an introduction, but you will probably find that some of the stuff that I'm talking about sounds quite technical, but hopefully it will inspire you to dig a little bit deeper if you're interested in some of the stuff that comes up. And feel free to ask me questions afterwards, or if you want to, you're welcome to email me as well. I haven't got my email. I think I might have got it at the end, but I'll give it to you anyway. If you need my email address, you're welcome to pop me a mail if you're interested. Okay, great. So, as stated, my background is an electrical engineer, and so I started off designing buildings and really focusing on energy mostly, but spread quite quickly into more sort of broader design and focused on green buildings. And so background is very much engineering and sort of the hard numbers, but touching on some of the softer sustainability aspects as well. This is just a quick overview of the kind of things I'll be touching on. Very short introduction on who I represent as an organization, why buildings and the built environment are important, what are green buildings, how do we define them, what are the benefits of green buildings, how are green buildings creating opportunities and what kind of opportunities in South Africa in particular, and then some examples of some interesting projects and a bit of short time for questions at the end. So very briefly, just wanted to kind of say where we as an organization sit as a Green Building Council, which is kind of my full-time employment, which most of the content really belongs to and comes from. We're a not-for-profit organization, non-governmental, that was established in 2007. And to sum it up, it's quite simple. Our purpose is to inspire a built environment in which people and planet thrive. And it's quite important that the two it's not just planet, but it's people as well. and the organization really in buildings exist typically not just for people, they exist for people, so it's really important to kind of understand the link between planet and people and the role that the built environment plays in that. So, as I mentioned, we're a not-for-profit established in 2007, and it was really just established through one person. You might know the name, Bruce Kurzweil, who was the managing director of Spire Properties at the time, and he just had an interest in sustainability and wanted on one of his projects to do a green building. And he just didn't know where to turn, and there was no standard in South Africa. So he went across to Australia for a conference, and he met the CEO of the Green Building Council there, and she said, well, why don't you start a Green Building Council? And so he's quite entrepreneurial, and he said, well, good idea. And off he went and found some funding, sort of some seed funding, and started the Green Building Council and the first convention, Green Building Convention, and so sort of kicked off the Green Building Council journey and really in many senses the green building journey for South Africa. We're a member-based organization, so organizations pay an annual membership fee, and then they can kind of be affiliated with us as an organization, and that's a large sort of way that we fund ourselves. And we're very much one of the early players in the global space, so sort of leading globally. We were the 13th country to actually become part of the World Green Building Council. So it's good to see that South Africa really was kind of quite sort of up and out there in terms of what's happening globally in terms of green buildings, and still is. So just quickly what we do, I'm not going to sort of go into detail on this. We advocate for change. A lot of that is really just wherever we can, through the media, to government, lobbying, and so on. Then we do a lot of training. We do structured training programs. So this today would be more of an advocacy type event where you have like short presentations and that, but we have full programs with online training and accreditation and exams and so on. So we offer courses in a number of streams within the property sector and green buildings. And then we certify. So the certification part is where we actually certify a building to be a green building. We've developed standards, and then those projects come to us and they want to be certified according to our standard. So we sort of play that role of an independent auditor, in a sense, to say, well, yes, your green building or your building has met the standard. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. We're part of the World Green Building Council in terms of an umbrella organization, and there's a bunch of sort of about 80 different countries that have got green building councils around the world. So it's quite a nice network that we can tap into in terms of knowledge and expertise and leadership globally that we're connected to. So really, this is really why do we as an organization exist, and why do we need to do this, and what role can you play? That's some of what I'll be talking about. So it's quite an interesting statistic, just simplified here, that about a third of global carbon emissions are from buildings. And typically that's actually higher. So Cape Town, the statistic is actually quite significantly higher, and they've actually measured this quite accurately. It's about 50%, just over 50%, that buildings contribute in terms of the overall carbon footprint for the city of Cape Town. That's very significant. If you think about transport and other and sort of industry, buildings are responsible for such a huge chunk. And it's not just energy and carbon emissions. Water is also a huge chunk, so that's fresh or potable water, about 12% globally, and then solid waste, about 40% of the built environment. So some of the sort of key aspects in terms of resources and waste generation, the built environment is really a large guilty party, and so we need to do something about that. This graph shows a couple of different sectors, and you don't have to worry too much if you can't read that. I'll explain what the graph is talking to. It's a study done by the World Resources Center, and the different color, so the different bars are looking at what is the cost of mitigating in a specific sector for greenhouse gas emissions. And the orange bar is sort of low cost mitigations, the grey bar is medium cost, and the sort of purple dark blue bar is high cost. And you've got the waste sector, then the transport sector, then forestry, energy supply, then industry, then agriculture, and then buildings. And so what you can see there is that buildings really represent the lowest cost and the greatest greenhouse gas emissions abatement potential as an industry. Which again, so you put the two together, this where we say buildings are sort of such a big proportion, plus this study basically says that the built environment buildings are low-hanging fruit in terms of carbon emissions reductions. So low-hanging fruit means you don't have to kind of go to much effort to access some of that. You can literally stand and just grab the fruit. It's available and it's not a lot of effort, and the reward is there. And so that's really what the findings were of the study, that it's a huge opportunity and there's a huge return on investment. And we'll talk to a bit of that, to the business case as well, a bit later on. Some of the metrics that we've sort of collected from the buildings that we've certified over time, I just kind of wanted to highlight here. In last year, September, we reached 400 green building certifications that we've issued, and that represents about 5.7 million square meters. So it's not a big number, 400. There are probably a couple of 100,000 buildings in the country, if not millions. There's no database. Unfortunately, nobody has a database of how many buildings there are in the country. Would be nice if there was such a database. But different departments, government departments, and so on, and the NHBRC and so on have got their own little databases. But there definitely are a couple of 100,000, if not a couple of million buildings out there. So 400 is still a very small number. But what I wanted to highlight is if you just look at some of the kind of impacts from those 400 buildings. So 570 million kilowatt hours per annum that will be saved every year from those 400 buildings, or 680 kilograms of CO2 every year. That's just one example, and that equates to about 40,000 homes, the equivalent of 40,000 homes. So that's 400 buildings is equivalent to about 40,000 homes. So, and that's just 400 buildings. So it's kind of to illustrate the potential that there still is. There are still thousands of buildings that can be transformed in this way, and the potential impact and savings that represents. So we still have a lot of our work cut out for us. There's still many years of work ahead in terms of transforming the industry, but some of that is already being demonstrated through the impact that's being had. Put all of that into the context of South Africa. It's a tough environment. We're a developing country. We have this context of a two-speed economy where you have a developed world and a developing world colliding, and that's the context that we live in. And the reality is that we have the largest proportion of the population that's living in the poorest conditions, that have got access to very poor infrastructure, yet at the same time we have some really amazing infrastructure, but very few of our sort of population have got access to that. So it's important to put sort of our green building journey and where we could be going as a country into that context, that we have a lot of real basic challenges that we still are dealing with. But the good thing is that we can sort of leapfrog. We don't have to go through 30 years of transforming infrastructure into something that's more sustainable. If we put in new infrastructure projects, we should actually be doing those in a sustainable manner. Immediately we can learn from a lot of international best practice and don't have to wait 30 years to apply that. So there's an opportunity as well with that. Then another, again, challenge, but that comes with opportunity, is the shift and the growth in the global population. So this is also a study done by the World Resource Center that Ernst & Young then built on. These graphics are from Ernst & Young, a study that they did. But you've got kind of on the top left, in 1950, approximately 67% of the world's population living in a rural context, and only 33% in sort of an urban context. 2008, approximately sort of 50-50 split, and then the projection is that by 2050, that there's kind of literally some sort of symmetrically opposite, 67% of the world's population will be living in cities. Then part of that is, where's most of this happening? Where's the biggest growth in population? Is in Africa and Asia. And that is about 1 million inhabitants sort of every week. So that's very significant. Obviously, it's not 1 million inhabitants arriving in Cape Town every week, but that's spread over sort of Africa and Asia. It's a very significant number that we're going to see, and certainly cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town are seeing that influx and that growth in population. So that is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. Is our infrastructure going to cope? How do we create homes, and how do we create space? How do we create transport infrastructure and all of the sort of services that need to accommodate for that? But just imagine the developer, the developer that's thinking, I can develop homes for all of these people that are arriving at our doorstep. Some of them will have jobs, some of them not. So there's definitely opportunities that are there, but also challenges linked to that. Then putting on the sort of global hat and the global perspective, you might have or might not have heard of what the UN developed as Sustainable Development Goals. There are a number of different Sustainable Development Goals that the UN sort of said are key and essential to all sort of globally, and what governments should really be sort of working towards. And so the World Green Building Council has done an analysis of those UN goals and said, well, how do green buildings fit into that? It's quite an extensive study, so I'm not going to go into it, but just to say that there's a very strong overlap with green buildings and how they support those global sustainable development goals. Okay, so drilling down to what is a green building. And you can have kind of two very different perspectives of what a green building is. One, the building on the left, which is at the V&A, which is where Alan Gray is based, at the Silo precinct. Beautiful glass, very sort of modern building. And then on the right, you've got a building out towards Kleinmond Way in the Overberg, sort of beautiful, very sort of contextual in that environment. Both of those are green buildings, but they're very different. So we've come up with our own definition of how we would phrase what a green building is, which is that a green building is a building which is energy efficient, resource efficient, environmentally responsible, including, and this is quite key, design, construction, and operations that significantly reduce or eliminate the impact of developments on the environment and occupants. And again, it's the environment and occupants. And so the key thing is there, it's right, sort of the entire life cycle of a building. It's not just how you've designed it. Really key is how do you actually operate it? What do the occupants do in the building over the life of the building? Okay. Then, are green buildings the same everywhere? Yes, maybe that definition is quite sort of a global definition, but you've got to drill down and say, well, is a green building in South Africa the same as a green building, I don't know, somewhere like Peru or Norway or Indonesia? Are there differences? And yes, absolutely, there must be differences because buildings respond to their local environment, not just in terms of climate, but also in terms of materials availability and a bunch of other local aspects, even in terms of socio-economic conditions. Green buildings need to respond to the local context. Otherwise, they just really are not green buildings and are just a copy of someone else's building that they thought was a nice design, but really doesn't achieve sustainability objectives in that local context. So what's happened in the last 20 years is that globally different countries have developed standards for green buildings that are contextual. Some of those standards have been picked up in other countries and are being used. We've developed a standard for South Africa, Green Star, and that was originally developed in Australia, and we've contextualized that for South Africa, so it's very much South Africa specific, and then we do contextualize that also for other African countries where there's demand. Okay. There's a couple of green building councils on the continent. Most of them are not really well established because they don't have much support yet from industry. So typically it's somebody who's maybe doing it on a part-time basis, an architect who wants to start a green building council but doesn't really have the time to kind of give it. So a lot of the other green building councils are in that space. Probably the most established is Kenya, where there's a bit of momentum. And then, interestingly, also in Namibia, there's some good momentum, and there's a few green buildings that have been built and certified in Namibia, which is great. So, just if you look at the South African context, as I was saying, you've got kind of very different contexts around different buildings, and even in terms of homes. There's such diversity in South Africa, both in terms of the type of natural environment, but also the type of socio-economic conditions. So therefore, the buildings have to respond differently. Okay. The standard that we've developed, and I'm not going to go into detail, but this is really just sort of high level on some of the categories and the components of the standard. But just to say that if you're interested, there's a 400-page technical manual that you can read that I'm happy to share with you if you like, and there's about 10 of those. So there's a bit of reading that will keep you busy for the next 10 years probably. But if you are really interested, you're welcome to email me and ask for a copy of any of those. But there's different components, just to say how we structured the green building standard, and these are very much aligned with international best practice. So there's a management component that talks to the design and the construction, the management of buildings, and that the entire sort of process in terms of design, construction, operation. Then, sorry, the text is quite difficult to read, but there's a component that talks to indoor environment quality. So what kind of daylight, what kind of fresh air, what kind of toxins are in the space, what kind of impact is there on the occupants in the building. So that's very much what that category talks to. Obviously, energy is key and is a fairly significant component of green building standards. Transport, funny enough, buildings don't necessarily move, but it's about how do people get to buildings, and how do buildings therefore play a role in influencing behavior around transport. So do you have the opportunity to locate your building? So now you're choosing a new home or a new office, whatever it is, can you locate that? Have you got the option of locating yourself close to a good public transport network? So take, for example, the Alan Gray building that I mentioned. They are reasonably close to the station in Cape Town, and they have shuttles that are available to go between. And so they are actually fairly accessible from a public transport access perspective. There's other sites they could have maybe chosen that are really, there's just no public transport other than maybe taxis. And so that would have made that component of their building less green. So there's really ways that our choices around buildings can influence our transport, even to the point where the standard rewards projects that have parking bays allocated to electric cars or reduce the amount of overall parking. So parking can really have a big impact on our behavior. In some cities, they've completely banned parking because they're really trying to eliminate people coming by sort of cars. And so there's different ways that transport within the boundary of the site can influence the green buildings and sustainability. Water is a big part, and especially in Cape Town and a large part of the country in the last while, this has kind of become more and more significant, but very much key to green buildings. Materials. There's a big focus on materials, things like embodied energy, how much energy has gone into creating the bricks that these walls are made up of, or how much are any of the materials toxic. There's a bunch of things around materials that are quite important to consider when one looks at green buildings. Then land use and ecology. This talks to your site and what was the condition of the site before you even started construction. Were there red-listed species? Was there a kind of a red-listed frog that had its habitat on the site, and because of your development, you've kind of now destroyed that habitat? How are you protecting those natural habitats? How are you enhancing them? And so green buildings play a role in making sure land use and ecology is sort of managed and maintained and even improved. There's some great examples of sites that have taken even contaminated land, where maybe, for example, there was an oil refinery or something like that, and that's actually been transformed, where suddenly there's a beautiful, sort of almost like a nature reserve. I don't know if any of you have been to Hotel Verdi, next to the airport. It's a great example of, and you can go there for lunch or for a drink if you like, and go for a walk around. There's a piece of land next to their site that belongs to the city of Cape Town, and it was a complete dump that was just a disaster and derelict and kind of a sight for sore eyes. But the hotel negotiated with the city that they take over the management of that portion if they can have the use of it. And they've really changed it into this beautiful, pristine wetland where the birds have returned. They've created a walk around it, and it really kind of is this oasis in the middle of an airport industrial. So it's really worth having a look at that, just to kind of get a sense of how can you actually transform ecology through the built environment and brings back some of the nature back into our cities that have often ended up as these hard concrete jungles. So buildings can play a significant role in that. Then emissions talk to, for example, stormwater. When you have big storm or rains and you have kind of the runoff that collects oil from the road on the parking, and it collects pollution, chip packet here or there, and that runs off into the stormwater system and ends up in a river and ends up in the sea. And so that's kind of part of what emissions talks to. Things like lighting, when you have some of our shopping centres around the corner that have these circular light bulbs that just emit light straight into the night sky, that actually impacts the behaviour of nocturnal animals, for example, bats, or flight paths for different birds and so on. So that is something that buildings can address by actually not allowing any light to go directly into the night sky. So that's kind of what the emissions category is talking to. What does a building emit that can actually be harmful to the environment, and how can we limit that? And then the last category that we include is something that really is trying to encourage innovation. Green buildings are really trying to push the envelope and be innovative, but we have to create standards. So we create boxes for things, but not everything fits into a box. And so we're really trying to say, well, we couldn't think of everything and we couldn't make the standard work for everything. You might be doing something really innovative that doesn't fit into our category. So tell us what you're doing and we can reward you for that. And so the standard then has got a bunch of different criteria and specifications, and you can choose which you'd like to target. But overall, you have to get sort of a minimum amount of points, sort of a points-based system, and then you tally that up to get to what your rating would be. So in terms of new buildings, the Green Star rating, sort of you can get a 4-star, 5-star, or 6-star rating. And a 6-star is kind of international leadership, versus 4-star is best practice. So that Alan Gray building at the waterfront, they achieved a 6-star rating, which is international sort of leadership. I'll show you a couple of examples later on of projects that have gone even further, where it goes to sort of zero impact, which is kind of ultimately what we want to do, or even regenerative, where you actually your building can actually be restorative and actually be supplying, not taking anything, but actually feeding back. For example, with energy or water, where there's a surplus that can be fed back into the grid or to a neighbouring site. Okay. We have developed also some socio-economic aspects to the standard. These are still optional. We haven't kind of mandated them. But they talk to things like job creation, skills development, empowerment, mixed income housing. So socio-economic factors that we know buildings and the construction process can create opportunities around. We've only had 2 projects so far that have actually used this part of the standard, so it's still quite new. And you would think that a lot of the stuff is kind of factored into projects and it's part of the BE codes and so on. But the reality is nobody's really auditing this. And so what this does, it actually audits it, and it says, yes, you said on your tender document you would do this, but actually now we're coming to see, have you actually done it? And so it's quite onerous, And that's why we've had such a sort of a low response thus far, because it's really onerous, and I think people don't necessarily, they're afraid to kind of expose maybe what they haven't done, which they've sort of committed to in an original tender document. So I think it's really fantastic for those projects that have achieved this, but we're really hoping to see a lot more around that, because it has a lot of potential for real socio-economic transformation in the built environment. Then if you think about green buildings, and just illustrating this through an example of a car, if you had to sort of think about buying a new car and you say, that's the car I want, and you say, I want to find out what is the fuel efficiency of this car. You get a specification from the supplier, off the website, wherever you get that, and you say, okay, yeah, this I like the performance of this car, this is what I want to go with, and I'm going to kind of trust this specification. But the reality is that when you then bought that car and you drive the car, the performance differs, and that you might not actually, it might not tie up with that specification that you had. And there's a number of different factors, but the biggest is probably the actual person that's driving the car. How do they drive the car? Is it being driven aggressively, or have you had a bad day and or you're late and you're in a hurry? How are you driving that car? That will sort of impact the performance. And so with buildings, it's absolutely the same. You can design the most beautiful green buildings, but it's all about how you operate, whether you're actually going to perform to how they were designed originally. And so this is a study that was done in the US, comparing on the left-hand side, those red dots are all different buildings, representing different buildings. And that was during the design stage and the specification. And you can see in terms of their performance, they were sort of approximately averaging at about 25% better than the sort of legal requirement for energy performance. And they were all quite sort of close within that range. Then those same buildings, when they actually measured them once they were in operation, you can see how much that varied. And imagine you had a project that was, say, over here in design, and then in operation, suddenly it's down here. How much money is that costing you? And suddenly it's just very irresponsible behavior in terms of the excellent design that was done, but then in performance, it just really isn't performing. So that's why I say that cycle of design through to operations is critical. The operations is really what matters. That's where the emissions are coming. When you've designed and you've got a drawing, there's no emissions yet. There's no carbon, there's no water being used. It's in the operation that it actually really only matters. So you also have some buildings that were designed badly, but then managed to do some things to actually perform well during operation. So really important to focus on operations. This slide just wanted to highlight the sort of stages of typical development and the sort of property context, where you have at a neighborhood scale or precinct scale, you have planning in cities and neighborhoods and precincts, say, for example, Century City. That precinct was planned out very well in advance, long time ago. What you see there now was conceptualized 20 years ago. But slowly over time, it's being built out. And the city had a role, and the developer had a role in what that plan looked like. The same with the V&A. This big precinct that is wonderful and is one of the sort of best tourist attractions that the country has, but there was sort of long-term planning that happened many years ago that influenced that. So that's really where everything starts, and you can make a very big difference in terms of how sustainable our cities are is if you address your planning. Just think about transport, for example, and how you can influence transport in the long term. If we just keep planning for highways and roads, we're just going to be kind of emitting more carbon. And if we change the planning around more public transport orientated kind of ways and other forms and making the city more walkable, we can make sort of, in 50 years' time, the city will be in a very different space. Then you look at the individual buildings and the actual tenants within the buildings. That's kind of the next stage in terms of how you build and design those. And then the actual operation, the existing operation. So we've developed standards for each of those stages, and there are projects and buildings that have kind of already used the standard in all of those. Then you have kind of different shades of green. It's not just, green is not just one color, but you get kind of the light green and you get the dark green. Similar to how our standard is a 4-star, 5-star, or 6-star, you kind of get these different shades. And so globally you have the same trend where you've got basically what the government requires, which is your lowest sort of common denominator. Everyone has to comply with that. And then there's standards sort of that go a notch further that say, well, you can be slightly more green than what the government requires, and so on, and it goes further and further, right to the point where you have either net zero or net positive. And so just wanted to give a brief explanation of net zero and net positive. We've developed a standard we released in 2017 that kind of talks to this. We developed a standard for carbon, for water, for waste and ecology. Most of the other countries that we were working with only focused on carbon. We felt in the South African context that carbon, yes, is critical, but water is equally critical. Waste and ecology, we can't ignore those. So the standard that we developed talks to those. Then I just wanted to illustrate just take one of those, carbon, what net zero means. It doesn't mean off-grid. And I think there can be confusion around this, and I'll explain why. Why we're not wanting to necessarily encourage homes and office buildings to disconnect from the grid, because the grid actually becomes a very powerful tool to transfer energy. If you've got excess energy in one building, what are you going to do with that if you're not connected to the grid? That excess energy can't go anywhere. So actually it's really important to have a grid so that when there is excess energy, you can actually feed that somewhere else where it's needed. Same with water. If you've got excess water that's usable, if it's just going to go into the stormwater system, what a waste. But if you can be feeding that back somehow, then that's more positive. So that's why we're not really trying to promote off-grid, but we're trying to say stay connected to the grid, and net zero basically means you're consuming as much from the grid as you're producing on site. So for carbon, it would basically be you're producing renewable energy on site, and that number matches the demand that you're taking from the municipality or the grid. If you then look at net positive, what you're saying is basically the orange, you're producing more renewable energy on site, and you've got an excess over a year compared to what you are consuming from the grid. And so you're able to feed that excess over an annual period into the grid. That graph sort of the year isn't really what it would look like. That's just sort of meant to give you an indication. Over a day, typically a building load for a commercial building will kind of start in the morning with sort of quite low and then build up as the aircon is turned up and lights and so on, peak in the afternoon and then drop off again. And so that's kind of typically what a building load for a commercial office building, and that kind of cycles like that and up and down winter and summer. But one has to look at it, if one's talking about net zero, one has to look at it over an annual period, 12 months, so that you get both the winter and the summer cycle into that. Because you'll have different energy use, different, for example, solar energy that you could gain over those different periods. So you kind of, one has to take it over a year-long period. And it becomes like an accounting exercise where you count all your kilowatt hours used on the municipal grid, and then you count all your kilowatt hours produced. And then you kind of see how does that tie up over the 12-month period, and then you can basically say, okay, yes, this building was net positive over this 12-month period. What we're hoping to see is more and more buildings have renewable energy on site and are able to either use that up directly on site, or if they've got excess, to be able to feed that back into the grid. And the wonderful thing is to see the City of Cape Town is really trying to be progressive, and they're leading in the space in the South African context by having a feed-in tariff. It's still quite low. I think it's about 66 cents or something in the residential sector, but over time that'll shift. So it's really just trying to slowly but surely transform the industry. That triangle is just trying to illustrate what we're trying to promote, and what one should really think of is start with efficiency. You don't want to have a really inefficient building that you throw a whole lot of renewable energy on, and because it's going to cost a lot more, and it's just a waste when you can really focus on efficiency first, and then you think about your on-site renewable energy. I'm not going to go into the detail of this now. It's kind of going too much detail. I want to then just talk a little bit about the benefits of green buildings, and kind of just summarize them in three main categories. I'm going to skip through some of the more detailed stuff just now, just to get to some of the project examples that I think you'll find interesting. But big one is obviously reductions in energy, in water, and so on, in kind of those resources that then also translate to cost savings. Then there's a very significant health benefit that I'm going to show you a short video on shortly that kind of illustrates some of that. And very significant business case, whether it's in the commercial sector or whether it's residential in our homes. So for the planet, I've kind of talked about this already, but in terms of ecology, here's quite a depressing graph from WWF. They do an analysis every year of the species that are going extinct, and the sad thing is that just continues to sort of increase in terms of the species that are going extinct, and how the built environment plays a really significant role, because we basically, as cities are sprawling, we're taking more and more habitat for our species, and so we're losing a lot of that through the built environment. Deforestation and mining, urban sprawl. It's funny how we have a sense, I kind of always thought Sydney is this incredible sustainable city, but if you just look at the footprint of Sydney, it's massive, and they have a huge transport challenge because they only really have transport going in like that, sort of into the centre, but not across. So there's very sort of developed countries with incredible cities, but they have massive challenges because of how the cities have just kind of sprawled, and there's many examples of that around the world. Cities who what seems like a very modern and sustainable city that have actually got some very fundamental things that are now embedded in how unsustainable kind of life has become and how expensive life has become, and so on. That is kind of really what urban sprawl has been responsible for. Then people, if you just think about how much time we spend in buildings every day. Some of us have the luxury maybe of spending less time in buildings and maybe being outdoors a bit more, but generally most of us spend so many hours in buildings. And so what are those buildings like? What is the sort of the air quality? What is the lighting quality? What sort of materials and toxins are in that space that make it a healthy or unhealthy space? And so I wanted to there's a study that Harvard have done quite recently, about 2 years ago, that I wanted to show you a short video on that kind of illustrates some of this just with something as simple as fresh air in a working environment, and what a significant impact that has.
We're really excited about this study because what we did was we tested several conditions, factors in the indoor environment, and how they relate to cognitive function performance of workers in office buildings. We asked people to come in, do their normal work routine, but from the floor below, we were able to modify the indoor environment. And at the end of the day, we asked them to take a cognitive performance test.
The way the system works is it immerses people in different real-world scenarios. There are many scenarios, and they're variously designed to evaluate just basic decision-making, leadership competencies, and so on. For example, you could be made a mayor of a town, and there are things happening in the town. There are different mini crises, and then a major crisis, and it's your task or the participant's task to actually take care of all the happenings in the town evaluate the crisis situations. And this really does replicate people's day-to-day worlds, and that's what the simulation scenarios have been validated to do.
The study design is very strong. It enabled us to see the effect if it existed, and it turns out we see a strong effect. So overall, we found a doubling in cognitive performance scores for people in the enhanced indoor environment versus the conventional. And 3 particular cognitive function domains jumped out. That was strategy, information usage, and crisis response in the optimized indoor environment. For the average person, this simply means the indoor environment is important. We spend 90% of our time indoors. It's logical that this has an outsized impact on our overall health and well-being. And what our study showed is that even minor improvements in indoor environmental quality can have big impacts.
So what they were doing there is really just increasing the amount of fresh air that was being introduced to the space. And so in other words, removing the CO2 that was being breathed out in the space. And just fascinating how that translated into such significant percentage of cognitive function. They did a second study, which is also on their website, that then took it down to a specific building and buildings. This was kind of almost more like a lab environment. But similar, they had similar results, not as extreme, because when you take it into a real building scenario, there's a lot of other variables that will influence the results. But if kind of just what this was sort of almost putting in a laboratory environment to just hone in on those exact cognitive functions and the impact of increasing fresh air. So very significant. I'm going to skip through these. These kind of just go into more detail. Then just dive into the economic benefit. And what I'm referring to is mostly commercial sort of property sector, but it translates very much into the residential sector as well, and into our homes. Same principles apply. So more resource efficient, which translates into cost savings. It costs less to operate, and lower risk, less reliance on the grid, for example, and so on. Increased health, demonstrating leadership and best practice, and then attracting and retaining staff. That's an interesting one. So take the Alan Gray example. So the fact that they've got a fantastic green building environment with really good indoor quality, and their whole sort of culture around sustainability is able to attract young people who would like to work in that environment. And that's kind of becomes part of how do you sell yourself as an employer, and how do you retain staff. Green buildings play a very significant role in that. Increased asset value, and I'll show you a study that we've done on that. Future proofing. This gets a bit technical, but for those interested in terms of the building value, how you value buildings is a sort of formula on the left-hand side. You take your revenue, you minus your costs, and then you divide by what the industry calls a capitalization rate. So if your revenue is going up because you've got more resource-efficient building that costs less to operate, costs going down, and don't worry too much about the cap rate, but just even without the cap rate going down, the property value will go up. And so we've done a study with an international organization who's got an office here as well, MSCI, who now do an annual green index with us, that they collect data, financial data from property owners around the country. And so there was a 2017 index and a 2018 index, but what I wanted you to just have a quick look at is the orange dot, which represents the total return on investment. On the right-hand side, at 5.9 is non-Green Star rated buildings or non-green buildings, and on the left is Green Star rated buildings. And that's almost a double in the return on investment in a one-year period that they measure that for the green buildings versus non-green buildings. So for investors, for pension funds and so on, that is very significant. To get that kind of a difference, if you look at your pension fund and you talk to your financial advisor, they'll be talking about a 1 or 2% difference is very significant. Now that's almost a sort of a 6% difference, almost double. It's very significant for investors. then obviously we do that every year and the market goes up and down. So when we did release the index this year, non-green buildings were 8% total return and green buildings 11.6 out of that study sample. So still showing the same trend, and that trend over the years has been demonstrating the same point in terms of the performance of those. Just to explain briefly, that blue part of the bar talks to the asset value and the sort of capital value of the property, and the non-green buildings really have kind of decreased in value, and the green buildings increased in value. So it's a kind of very clear finding out of the study that is kind of talking to that as well. I'm going to skip through that just to get to some of the projects. We've done a detailed study if you're interested. I'm also not going to dive into this, but on the actual cost, how much does it cost to build a green building? Because there were a lot of people there was a myth that was just going around for many years and still exists in many sort of contexts that green buildings just cost more to build, and a lot more. People were saying 20%, and we've still asked people, what do you think it costs to build a green building? And they say maybe 20% more, 30% more. And so we did the study, and we found from the actual green buildings, the average from the study in 2009 to 14 was 5% extra. And now with the more recent data, it's about 3.9% on average. And obviously some are much less and some are a little bit more. It really depends on the project and all of what they did on the project specifics. But really debunks that myth that green buildings cost a lot more. And if you think about the graph I showed earlier about the increased return on investment, suddenly that bit of extra spend makes a lot of sense. And that's why some of the big listed property funds have really bought into this hook, line, and sinker, because they're able to get a much better return and they're able to de-risk a lot of their property portfolios. So it really is very significant. The challenge is that a lot of the big funds they want more data, and so the number is still quite small in terms of green buildings and the samples that this is based on. So a lot of them sort of aren't as happy to rely on the data samples that are there, but those that get it and really have researched it and understand it, so the likes of Growth Point and Redefine and a few others, really kind of doing this green building quite aggressively. And this, don't worry too much about the detail, but just shows that over time, that dotted line is showing that over the years, that average cost is coming down. So technology is becoming cheaper, people are getting more familiar and trained up, and capacity is there. So over time, we'll get to a point where it costs 0% more to do a green building. Also, again, just another graph to show the growth of green buildings over the last couple of years and our economy, our GDP, which is quite sad. It's kind of how the GDP has been declining, but yet in a declining economy, the growth of green buildings has been so significant. So it's talking to that same point, is in tough times, it makes even more sense to be doing green building. Okay. Then some of the opportunities that come about with the, sort of the movement and what's termed green economy. So the Department of Environmental Affairs has got a whole green economy program, and that's trying to drive change in industry. So this is just a graph showing the PV industry globally and how that's grown over the last couple of years. This is in South Africa, just in South Africa over the last, about 6 years. And that is incredible growth. And there's whole new industries that now exist around that, not just sort of in the residential market, but in the big, large sort of couple of 100 megawatts. And so you've got heat pumps and a whole bunch of other technologies and patents that are growing, that one can see how the industry has grown. Something interesting as well is in the green building space, just how many women are involved, which is really exciting. I just put this graph together from LinkedIn from green building consultants that are working in the space, all ladies. Those are about, about 40 or so. And they really are, it's amazing how it's an